As the NATO prepares for the summit in Lithuania, a major question that's looming over the military alliance is whether it will fulfill its full membership promise made to Ukraine. In fact, NATO's Secretary General had earlier repeated his call that Ukraine may become a member of the military alliance. Even as he took a strong stance against Russia, he warned that the upcoming summit will send out a clear message. However, on the other side, the alliance is divided over Ukraine's membership. Some members worrying that any wrong step can take the alliance closer to war with Russia. Some members are worried about Ukraine's readiness. Ukraine is still at war, and this stops the NATO from giving it full membership because one policy of the alliance requires territorial disputes to be resolved before accession. Another issue being the corruption in Ukraine, which will be a matter of intense discussion among the Western countries. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is pressing the NATO to make clear how and when Ukraine can join after the war. The United States and Germany are opposing any direct indications on invitation or membership, as they still call for security assurances instead of membership. Meanwhile, the NATO's Eastern European members are calling for clearer roadmaps for Kiev to get a NATO membership. The other problem is Russia itself. In the year 2008, remember, Russia led the lobbying to keep Ukraine and Georgia out of NATO. However, even after the war, experts predict the influence of Russia has not completely vanished from the NATO. Some members say a NATO membership to Ukraine may also encourage Vladimir Putin to continue the war. Moscow claims the declaration, the Bucharest Declaration, proves that NATO is a threat to Russia. On the other hand, Ukraine is pressing the NATO to complete its promise. Ahead of the summit on Tuesday, the Kremlin has said that the Ukrainian membership of the NATO military alliance will have very negative consequences for Europe's security architecture and would invite a harsh response. And for more on this, with me on the broadcast is Rich Outsense, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation, with me live on the broadcast. Thanks very much for being here. I have to ask you first for your initial reaction to the way we've seen these discussions regarding Ukraine being a part of the NATO fold pan out over the last few days and weeks.
Well, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me. I haven't been terribly surprised because the several voices that you hear are all rather predictable. On the one hand, Ukraine obviously wants to get all of NATO behind it in a formal and irrevocable manner, and membership is the way to do that. So Ukraine's been pushing hard. It's been lobbying other members of NATO to support. And for instance, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey came out last week in strong support of Ukrainian membership, saying that Ukraine deserves a spot in NATO. So we haven't been surprised by how that's played out, that charm offensive, if you will, by Zelensky to try to get support for it. On the other hand, the group of sort of larger, more conservative Western powers, including the United States, as evidenced by President Biden's words yesterday, ruling out rapid membership or membership for Ukraine and NATO before the end of the war. They're looking at a couple of things. First of all, how to signal to Moscow that ending the war may still yield some acceptable political outcomes. And whether Ukraine formally joins NATO, whether they do so quickly, whether they do so slowly, this is part of the endgame planning. So the United States wants to avoid anything that will further inflame or escalate Moscow's intentions on that side. And they're saving NATO membership for Ukraine as part of that endgame piece. And, you know, for Russia to say that this would have a negative outcome and that there would be consequences, what's Russia going to do in any case? Are they going to launch a war? They've already done that. So I think everyone's playing the part that the script has for them on this. In the end, I just don't think that it's, as you've said earlier in your introduction, it's not appropriate to go through this accession formal process while the country's at war. There has to be a settlement of the territorial disputes. And so I suspect there'll be some positive signals, some talk about a roadmap. There will be greater clarity, but there will be no Ukraine accession at the Vilnius summit or in the immediate future.
Right. Speaking of which, I also want to ask you to comment on what's brewing within Russia at this point. Now, after the failed Wagner mutiny and the question marks over the whereabouts of the Wagner chief, and now we have this latest development where there are reports of the Wagner chief having met the Russian president just days after that mutiny. What do you think is really brewing there? And multiple question marks over what the plan here really is. And whether there is more to this than what's meeting the eye at this point.
Well, Russia retains its ability to mystify Westerners, myself included. I think there's a couple of dynamics here. The first is that Prigozhin is Putin's man, and he's made clear that he was not trying to overthrow Putin or seize government control. He was trying to, in essence, get rid of the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the Military Services, so Shoigu and Gerasimov, whom he blames for having poorly executed the war. Now, he had a little bit of a risk window. He had to go enough to make a point, but not enough to really invoke Putin's wrath, because at the end, Putin still has his hands on the levers of power. Many in the West, myself included, thought that maybe this was a real tipping point for Putin, but that ends up being wrong. I think the fact that Prigozhin and some of the Wagner bosses, so to speak, the mafia bosses, if you will, were in Moscow meeting with Putin days after this all happened shows that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that Russia puts out, smoke and mirrors, so that people don't know what's really going on. But what's really going on is Putin and his handpicked men trying to figure out a workable deal with all the egos and all the competition for power below the level of Putin. So Prigozhin's still his man, and I think he lost this little gambit to get rid of Shoigu and Gerasimov, and they're patching it up or mending fences enough to continue the war.
All right, Rich Outsen, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast.
Good to see you. Thanks.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on the move.